This morning we continue our series from the book of Daniel looking at four young men who are spending the bulk of their lives in a place that is not their own. And hopefully that is helping us understand our own lives and our own time here as we both live in our culture and reach out to our culture. How many of you are amazed anytime that you turn in one of your prescriptions and you get the prescription back and the prescription is exactly what you turned in? I'm amazed all the time that when I turn in a prescription that what the pharmacist gives me is exactly what I asked for when I turned in the prescription. The handwriting, I can't read it. But they apparently can. But the reality is they can't all the time. Doctors are notorious for bad handwriting, and they come by that honestly. By the way, they've also studied why the handwriting is bad. But a study done just about 3 years ago said that 82% of nurses and 75% of pharmacists can read it. Can read it. That means then that there's a gap in not being able to read those prescriptions. It means 25% of the time they're unable to read those prescriptions, and apparently even moving toward more electronic prescriptions hasn't completely solved the problem, and it can be harmful. There was a study done in the late 90s, and it was still true about 15 years ago, that about 7,000 people die a year because the prescription was not written correctly or somebody couldn't read it. But our story today involves handwriting. There is handwriting that shows up in the midst of the story, and nobody can read it. That's one guy. And there's only one guy on the planet that can read it, and that is by design. We are in the book of Daniel again this morning. We've been in Daniel for the past 3 weeks, and we're tracking the stories of Daniel and his three friends. Now, today's story occurs quite late. In fact, this is many, many years after the story that we had last week with the furnace of fire. In this story, Daniel is probably a pretty old man by now. Nebuchadnezzar is not on the scene. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar is not even in the story. His grandson is, and his grandson is running the show. And Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, they by this time are old and they are legend. That becomes part of the story as well today. They are known. But as we follow Daniel, Mishael, Azariah, and Hananiah and what they are doing in Babylon, it becomes helpful for us to see what they are doing because, again, they are living in a land that is not their own. We've said it often in the past few weeks. Again, they have been transplanted from Jerusalem to Babylon, and in many ways that is very much like us. We are living in Babylon. In fact, Babylon throughout the scriptures basically is any nation that is not Israel. The rest of the world is Babylon. So what does it mean to be both a citizen of our Babylon, our particular culture, our context? What does it mean to be a citizen of the United States? And not just the United States, but Russia, China, Mexico, Iran, England. What does it mean to live in a nation, be a citizen of that nation, but also be a citizen of heaven? I'm going to turn this off if it keeps going this way. So we have an opportunity to see these guys in action and then allow what's happening to them, and allow the gospel as it's being presented through them to say something to us in our own time. And we do live in a culture, we do live in a context of which, again, we are allowed to vote. We are allowed to have a say in how we are being ruled. At the end of the day, though, we are also to submit to that rule. Again, because God has set up this temporary kingdom. The temporary kingdoms of this world are also set up by God. They are temporary. We have to remind ourselves of that. Babylon was temporary. In fact, we're going to see today, the Babylon, there's a transition, there's a shift. It's no longer the world power. Powers come and they go. That's why it's important for us to remind ourselves that we are citizens of another kingdom that is not temporary, that is eternal. So our story, again today, is revolving around those same ideas. Mike is going to help us read our story today. But to set it up, the event that we're looking at today, again, takes place many, many years after the furnace of fire. And there's another guy named Belshazzar who is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. He is the one running the show. He is king. He's considered king of the city of Babylon. Sometimes that can become difficult to understand in the context. There is the grand empire that's called Babylon, but there's also the city of Babylon. And Belshazzar is king of the city and that region. He throws a party. Daniel 5 begins with Belshazzar throwing a party. And it's not your ordinary party. He invites 1,000 of the country's best-known people, nobility, important people, the ones who are running the country. He invites 1,000 of them to this big party, this big banquet. And what's interesting about this banquet is the ominous tones that are part of, as soon, if you're reading this, you begin to see something isn't right. The very first thing we see in the story that isn't right is when Nebuchadnezzar had gone to Jerusalem, had taken those 4 guys and their friends and lots of people. I mean, he transferred a lot of people out of Jerusalem. He basically stripped them of those who could do things, the country's elite, the educated, those that could do things for his country, do things for his economy, and serve in that society. He took them out. He also raided the temple. He took the temple. And in taking the temple, he didn't destroy it at the time he takes all these people, but what he did was he took all he took the furniture. I know. That's bad, isn't it? That's not good. That is going to be. So let's just run off the other mic. You going to give me a hand help? All right. I probably got a short one. All right. So he takes he raids the temple. He takes all the utensils, he takes all the furniture, he takes the goblets, he takes the dinnerware, he takes all the gold out of the temple. And what we find in this story is Belshazzar, in throwing this party, he's throwing this party in honor of the Babylonian gods, and he's using the dinnerware and the templeware in order to do this. He is mocking the God of Israel. That's part of it. So immediately we're introduced with this idea. We got a guy who is pretty full of himself. He's going to honor his gods, and while he's honoring his gods, for whatever reason known only to Belshazzar, he's going to stick a finger in the eye of the God of Israel. We also notice as we move through this story that Daniel hasn't been invited. Of course he wasn't invited. They're using the utensils from his temple in this pagan party. The other thing we know, because of the way this story develops, is that this party is thrown with Cyrus on his doorstep. In fact, history tells us this. Cyrus is on his doorstep. He has surrounded Babylon. He has surrounded the city. He's knocking on the door. This party is the last hurrah. This party is a last hurrah for the nobility, for all those people who are important. They know that what's coming is not good. And it's to the gods, so they're also hoping that one of their gods is going to bail them out. But in doing so, they are sticking a finger in the eye of the God of Israel. And so there's this party, and this party is crashed. In the midst of this party, there is a hand that shows up. One of the pieces of furniture that had been taken from the temple that they are using as part of this grand pagan display is the menorah that was in the temple, the big one. The big one, the one that had been created by Moses. It was overlaid in gold. It was a magnificent piece. And it is creating light for the party. It was what created light for that inner part of the temple. That menorah was associated with God's glory. God is the one who was considered to be the one who lights the menorah, keeps the menorah lit. It is His glory that radiates through the temple. And so right next to that menorah, this hand appears on the wall, as if it came from the menorah itself. And that hand has a finger, and that finger begins to write. Belshazzar has a meltdown. He absolutely has a meltdown. He is terrified, he's horrified, as are the guests. This seems ominous. So he asks his, the religious leaders of his day, the pagan priests, "Hey, what's this about? What's the message on that wall?" And just like we've seen already in our stories here in the book of Daniel, they can't interpret. They can't read it. It's, what's interesting is it is in their language. They have no idea what it's trying to communicate. And that makes him even more terrified. The queen, who is probably his mother, also apparently not part of this party, hears about the commotion. She shows up and she says, "You know what?" And it's almost like Belshazzar knows what's coming. Because Belshazzar knows the stories. There is a guy who can interpret this for you. There's a guy who used to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. There's a guy who can interpret these words. And sure enough, that is Daniel. So Daniel shows up. This is what Daniel says to Belshazzar. Mike?
But you, his successor, Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, even though you knew this all. You knew all of it. Instead, you have exalted yourself against the Lord and the heavens. The vessels of his house were brought to you, as you and your nobles, wives, concubines, drank from them. You praise the gods that made of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or understand. But you have not glorified the God who holds your life's breath in His hand, and who controls the whole course of your life. Therefore, He sent the hand, and this writing was inscribed.
Now you see that? Therefore, He sent the hand. Whose hand is this? Yeah. The very God that you are mocking. That's His hand. This is His writing. They've been mocking using the temple dinnerware, using the menorah, and this handwriting shows up right next to the menorah.
You're asking about whose handwriting this is? Oh yeah, it's that guy. It's the one you are mocking, the hand of the Most High. Remember, the running theme in Daniel throughout the entire book is the Most High is ruler, the Most High has an eternal kingdom, and the Most High rules over human kingdoms. And the Most High's hand is now writing on Belshazzar's wall. Now, about that message, Mike.
This is the writing that was described. Tekel, and Parson. This is the interpretation of the message. Meaning means God that has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel means that you have been weighted on the balance and found deficient. Paris means that you have that your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians.
All right. Many, Tekel, Parson. Yeah, they thought it was ominous when that hand started writing. Belshazzar has an internal meltdown. He's terrified. And now the message is as ominous as it seemed. The terror and being terrified was warranted. God has numbered your days. The kingdom is at its end. You have been weighed on God's scales and have been found to be deficient. And that guy that's just outside the city, that guy that's knocking on the door, Cyrus, oh yeah, your kingdom is being divided. It is going to that guy. Your kingdom is being taken away from you. See, Nebuchadnezzar, he learned the hard way. He spent 7 years of insanity, but he finally came to the realization that this guy, that these Hebrews, by the way, that he had running his economy, including Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these four guys that he had brought into his kingdom, God sent them. God sent them. And all along the way, Nebuchadnezzar is always having some sort of an issue with these four guys. He finally ends up realizing and admitting and confessing the Most High is ruler. My kingdom is not my own. The Most High rules over human kingdoms. Belshazzar has not learned it. Daniel says, look, yeah, your grandfather knew all this. You know those stories. And now God has come to collect your kingdom. There are very few passages in the Bible where God's rule over human kingdoms is as explicit as it is here. We're watching history being made in this story. There is going to be a transfer of power. The power is moving from Babylon to the Medes and the Persians and to a guy named Cyrus. And oh, by the way, that's where the hope is. If you're Daniel, if you're an Israelite, you know who Cyrus is because Cyrus is your Savior. But that guy has come to collect the kingdom from Belshazzar. So here's how that story ends. Mike?
Then Belshazzar gave an order, and they clothed Daniel in purple, placed a gold chain around his neck, and issued a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the king of Chaldean, was killed. 31, and Darius the Mede, received the kingdom at the age of 62. 32 and 31 and Darius the Mede received the kingdom at the age of 62. 33 and Darius the Mede received the kingdom at the age of 62. 34 and Darius the Mede received the kingdom at the age of 64. 35 and Darius the Mede received the kingdom at the age of 66. 37 and Darius the Mede received the kingdom
By the way, Darius and Cyrus are the same guy here. So what Daniel says comes to pass. Belshazzar admits defeat. He had promised a gold chain and being able to be third in charge of the kingdom. If somebody could interpret, sure enough, Daniel does. And as part of his, okay, all right, I know what you say is true. Belshazzar knows this. He knows this. It's almost like a sad resolution. And it's that very night, Belshazzar loses his life. He loses his kingdom. The kingdom is given to the Medes and the Persians and to a guy named Cyrus. What the hand had written came to pass. The very same finger that fingered the Ten Commandments, that is the hand, that is the finger of the Most High. And in a very real way, in a very stark way, he is emphatically saying that the Most High is ruler over human kingdoms. The kingdom is not Nebuchadnezzar's. The kingdom is not Belshazzar's. These kingdoms belong to the Most High. There are two takeaways from the story. The first one, I hope, is obvious, and that is the hand belongs to the Most High. The hand belongs to the one who created the world. The hand belongs to the one, again, the finger that fingered the Ten Commandments. Human kingdoms belong to the Most High. And as this story continues and develops, and then over the next few hundred years, comes Jesus. And one of the things that we're told about Jesus, one of the things that's anticipated in the book of Daniel, is that the one who is coming, this Most High who is coming, is going to be given once and for all the kingdoms of the world, and his kingdom is going to be eternal. We know that person to be Jesus. He is the Most High, and he is ruler of the human kingdoms. So the first thing we need to understand is what we have around us. This doesn't belong to the guy in the White House, whoever he is. This is Christ. All the human kingdoms belong to Jesus. He controls who's in and who's out. Daniel says to Belshazzar, look, this Most High who rules human kingdoms, it is his right to set up the king and to bring down the king. That's all part of his conversation. So whoever's in and whoever's out, ultimately, that is Jesus and his prerogative. And so we take comfort in that. We take comfort in that. Yes, we involve ourselves in the process, but at the end of the day, we comfort ourselves with the fact that ultimately Jesus is still on his throne. He reigns. And oh, by the way, anybody who is on any throne anywhere and is ruling over anything anywhere is all part of Jesus' design. This isn't out of his control. This is part of his design for us. We can rest knowing that Jesus is ultimately the King, even of our own temporal kingdom. The second thing may not be obvious, but it is also here as well. Remember how I said Cyrus is sitting there as the hope? Cyrus is sitting there as the hope. If we trace what Cyrus is going to do throughout the rest of the book of Daniel, he is going to save Israel. He is going to be the one who sends people back to Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, rebuild society. He is considered a savior. The gospel is present here. This is part of our salvation story. The hand that is writing on the wall, the message that is for Belshazzar, is also a message for us in the grand story of redemption. You understand that finger that is writing is explaining our own situation, is explaining our own story. You understand that because we are sinners, that God has weighed and reckoned our kingdoms. You understand that we have all been weighed on His scales and found deficient. And oh, by the way, our kingdoms are not ours. They have been given to another. You see, this hand that is writing on the wall is a message for us. And that ominous tone that is there for Belshazzar is our ominous tone. And in the moment, it seems like there's no hope because all of us at one time or another, at any given moment, have been weighed in God's scales and have been found deficient. But if we look closely, if we look very, very closely to the hand that is writing on the wall, we will see that when the hand is writing on our wall, there is a nail print in that hand. You see, the Most High, who's writing on Belshazzar's wall, ultimately is going to come as a baby. We're about to celebrate that in just a few weeks. Going to come as a baby, going to die, and going to rise again. Why? Because we've all been eating at the pagan table. We've all been taking the gifts that we have been giving and using them for King Me. We're all like this. We're all King Me. Life is all about me. I want life to be about me. I don't want to hear about Nebuchadnezzar's story. And so that hand comes and it starts writing, and I look closely at the hand. There's a nail print in that hand. Why? Because we've been found deficient. But unlike Belshazzar, we have been found deficient. While we were deficient, while we were found lacking on God's scales, Romans chapter 5, Christ died for us. While we were still sinners, while we were coming up short, Christ died for us. That hand writing on the wall is a hand that is going to die for us. That hand has nail prints. And you know what? The amazing thing about the hand that's writing on our walls with the nail print in it, we get to go free. Judgment is not ours. And you know what we get? We get His kingdom. He gives us His kingdom. Even though we don't deserve it, even though we deserve everything that Belshazzar got, we don't get it. He gives us a kingdom in His grace and in His love. He gives us His life. He gives us His peace. He gives us His forgiveness. He gives us another kingdom. A kingdom that is His. A kingdom in which we are invited to rule and reign with Him. And He extends His rule and His reign. You know how He extends that kingdom? The kingdom that that hand has given us. You know how He extends it? When we connect others to Himself. That's why we're here. You know, we meet every week around a kingdom meal, celebrating King Jesus with the King's message. This is an expression of His kingdom. His kingdom expands. His kingdom moves. His kingdom grows bigger as this gathering expands. And so as we think about what we're doing even through the Christmas season, even as we move into 2021, you know, we have to remind ourselves that the kingdom that He's given us isn't simply for us. It's for our neighbors. The kingdom that we enjoy here is for our neighbors. So let's be all about kingdom expansion and telling the story of the hand that is writing on the wall. Yes, an ominous message, but the hand that writes has nail prints in those hands. Nail prints for you, nail prints for me, nail prints for our neighbors.